We're talking about another Raja Shehadeh book. We're talking about Going Home, which is kind of like a spiritual successor to the book we spoke about last week, Palestinian Walks. Before we start, as always, I want to tell you that in the description down below, you can get this book from bookshop.org, which is a company that works with local bookstores to give them a little bit of extra funding whenever you buy a book from bookshop.org, which is awesome. So get that from the description down below, or pick up this book from your local library, because supporting libraries is awesome. Going Home by Raja Shehadeh is kind of like Palestinian Walks, which is where he spoke about 6 different sarhas or walks he took in the West Bank and kind of his feelings and thoughts around it. Going Home, however, is just following him through one walk, which was on the 50th anniversary of the Israeli occupation. So it was in 1967, Israel officially occupied the West Bank and Gaza, and this was in 2017 when this book came out. So a good few years ago, but about 10 years after Palestinian Walks came out. And this book mostly surrounds Ramallah, where Raja Shehadeh lives. And just like Palestinian Walks, there's a lot of things that really frustrated me, and you can tell Shehadeh's frustration as well in this, not just in regards to the occupation, not just in regards to the PLO, but for him also, he talks about his frustrations with himself and his family life. It's a little bit more personal than Palestinian Walks. I feel like Palestinian Walks, although it was a personal book, it also was more about the West Bank and Palestine as a whole, whereas this book is also got a lot about the West Bank and Palestine, a lot about Ramallah, and also a lot more about himself and his family life, which I thought was really good. It was nice to get that extra kind of knowing a little bit more about him. I think it's the 3rd Raja Shehadeh book I've read, and I think this is the one where I felt the most like I understood him, and I got a little bit more gleaming of him and how he felt. So that's why I thought this was really a great book. It got me closer to him. Obviously, I feel like reading this after Palestinian Walks, like within a week of reading Palestinian Walks, was also really good, because I've had that kind of catharsis and frustration from Palestinian Walks while I was reading that. So when I read Going Home, I was able to process a lot of the stuff he was talking about better, because I got the frustration out when I read the previous book. Now, like I said, this book concentrates more on Ramallah, more on basically how he's seen the city change during his life, how when he was a young man, Ramallah was far less built up. It felt more safe, maybe isn't the correct word, but you know, kind of how your parents or your grandparents will say, back in my day, we didn't sit on our computers, or we played outside on the street. There's a little bit of that in this, but also he does say, well, part of that is because prior to Israeli occupation, Ramallah felt a little bit safer. There was a little bit less, you know, you're scared of an imminent Israeli occupation again, or an imminent Israeli incursion into Ramallah, like happened, I think it was in 2002, around the time of the Second Intifada, or I think during the Second Intifada. And also, you know, you didn't have to deal with Israeli soldiers when you were trying to get certain permits, because when he was a youth, it was Jordan he was dealing with. Or even he also speaks about how the changes the PLO made have, in his view, maybe not negatively affected Ramallah, but has made it a very different place compared to how it was when he was a young man prior to Israeli occupation, and even during Israeli occupation. I think it's a really good way of seeing how a city in the West Bank, a city in Palestine, has changed over the course of one man's life. Obviously, I think Shehadeh's about in his 70s, maybe 80s at the moment. So this book was probably written when he's about in his late 60s, 70s. And it does kind of have that feeling of how the city has evolved with him and how he has evolved as a person. Another place where the book really deviates from Palestinian Walks is where he talks a lot more about his family, particularly his mother and father, because it talks about the very different lives they've lived, or at least the different effects the occupation has had on their lives. Where Shehadeh's father and mother, who prior to the creation of Israel, to be honest, were fairly affluent. They had very high-ranking jobs or high-ranking families in Palestine prior to the creation of Israel. And he talks about how the Nakba really affected his mother and his father, how their lives changed, how even the way they felt and spoke and sort of processed the Nakba was different to how he felt and how he grew up. You know, also for him, it's how he dealt with the occupation of 67 and how that compares to how his parents felt during it. How for him, he really wanted to, and even as a person he was conflicted as well, he wanted to really fight the occupation, how he wanted to end the occupation, how he felt about the Intifada compared to perhaps how his father went about it, how his father's idea of combating Israel was maybe a brand new separate state, where his father had this real belief in justice, where Shehadeh, on the other hand, having, you know, been a young man, still living, a young man prior to the occupation, or at least a young boy prior to the occupation, how he felt compared to that. He didn't really trust the courts as much, or at least he got to a point where he didn't trust the courts as much, and he felt the best way to go about it was, instead of trying to trust Israel when it came to creating a separate Palestinian state, he was more like, how about I fight what Israel is currently doing under the current occupation? Kind of like how his father was going slightly more down the law route and he was going slightly more down the human rights activist route, and kind of how he felt they were at loggerheads. But now that he is the age his father was when his father passed away, he understands his father's perspective a lot more, and kind of how that reflects on Palestine and Ramallah and the West Bank, how kind of as he's aged and as the city has changed, he's also changed, and he understands that. And although he is nostalgic for a lot of the stuff in his youth and his past, he understands the changes, although perhaps the changes aren't exactly what he prefers. Kind of like how he felt the nationalist spirit of Palestine, because the people of Palestine have been so worn down, it's moved away from this secular nationalism to more of a using religion as a form of nationalism, which is something we do see in various parts of the world, which I thought was a really interesting observation. And especially for me as an outsider looking at Palestine, who my views on Palestine, and again, I'm not Palestinian, so I cannot tell the Palestinians how to think. This is just my personal view. I see it more like Shehadeh, where I'm like, I see a nation as a more secular state, and a nationalist movement should be more secular, especially, and by nationalist movement I don't mean, you know, like the bad nationalist movements, I mean like freedom from colonialism type movement, should be more secular and behind the nation and the idea of the nation. Whereas I know there's a lot of people who are Muslim who kind of have this idea that no, the driving force behind Palestine should be more of a religious thing. Again, I am not Palestinian, I am not correct, I am just a person who has that view. A Palestinian person should not be overridden by my view, obviously. So yeah, that's it's kind of interesting. Like I said, I understood Shehadeh slightly more during this book. So this book I definitely recommend reading after you've read Palestinian Walks. I think it's a good spiritual sequel to that book, and I think especially if you've read a couple of his books, that's kind of the way I would go about it. So yeah, it's slightly less of a look at Palestine and the West Bank that Palestinian Walks was, but but more of a look at Shehadeh himself and Ramallah as a city. Thank you for watching. As always, the link to the book is going to be in the description down below, linking to bookshop.org, which works with local bookshops to get them a little bit more funding. But if you can, try and get this book from your library, or see if your library can order it in. Furthermore, in the description down below, you're going to get links to all my socials, my Instagram, my Patreon, my Goodreads, and also, most importantly, an UNRWA donation link is going to be in the description down below for you to hopefully donate to if you can, or share the link with someone who you know can donate. Thank you for watching. Hey, if you've read this book or this sort of inspired you to read this book, please let me know down below. Shout out to this commenter for actually putting me onto this book. I wouldn't have read it without that comment, so thank you so much for letting me know. That's why I love the comments down below. I love when you guys interact. But yeah, thank you for watching, and I hope you read a great book today. Also, I got a haircut. Haircut.